Café buzzed faintly with the hum of a coffee machine and the occasional clinking of spoons against ceramic cups. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the quiet rhythm of the day lulled the staff into a sense of routine. Emma, a young waitress juggling 2 jobs to support her son, stood behind the counter, wiping glasses with a practiced hand. The tranquility shattered when a sleek black SUV pulled up outside, its tinted windows glinting under the pale winter sun. Emma paused, her breath catching slightly. The vehicle looked out of place in their small, cozy neighborhood, a symbol of wealth and power that rarely graced their little cafe. The door opened, and out stepped a figure that made everyone freeze. Tall, composed, and dressed in an understated yet impeccably tailored black coat. He moved with a quiet confidence that commanded attention. Barron Trump. There was no mistaking him. His sharp features and towering presence had made him a familiar figure in countless news articles and TV broadcasts. Yet, seeing him here in their humble cafe felt surreal. Emma's heart raced as he pushed open the cafe door. The soft chime of the bell overhead seemed almost deafening in the silence that followed. He walked in alone. No bodyguards, no entourage, just him. The air grew thick with curiosity and a touch of nervous energy as the few patrons and staff exchanged wide-eyed glances. Barron scanned the room briefly, his expression calm yet unreadable. His eyes landed on an empty table near the corner, and he made his way there without hesitation. Emma, still gripping the glass in her hand, realized it was her turn to act. She smoothed her apron and took a steadying breath before approaching his table. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice slightly trembling. "May I take your order?" He looked up, his deep blue eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, she felt as if time had slowed. "A cappuccino and a slice of chocolate cake, please," he said, his voice low but kind. As she scribbled down the order, Emma noticed something peculiar. He carried a small, worn leather notebook, which he placed gently on the table. He opened it, the pages filled with handwriting, and began to write. What could he possibly be jotting down? The cafe, once filled with mundane chatter, now buzzed with silent speculation. The cafe's hum had shifted, its usual warmth replaced with a quiet tension that hung in the air like an unspoken question. Barron Trump sat in the corner, an unassuming figure whose very presence seemed to shrink the world around him. Emma, still processing the surreal moment, returned to the counter to prepare his order. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the coffee beans, the weight of his gaze still lingering. The chatter among the staff had dwindled to whispers. "What's he doing here?" one of them murmured. No one had an answer. Outside the window, the black SUV idled silently, a stark reminder of his world, one so far removed from their own. Balancing the tray with practiced ease, Emma approached his table once again. She had served hundreds of customers before, but something about this moment felt different, heavier. As she placed the steaming cappuccino and the delicate slice of chocolate cake before him, Barron glanced up. His face, calm yet thoughtful, softened with a slight nod of thanks. "Is everything to your liking, sir?" she asked, her voice steadier this time, though her heart still raced. "Yes, thank you," he replied, his tone polite but distant. Then, unexpectedly, he asked, "What's your name?" The question caught her off guard. "Emma," she answered, unsure if he'd remember it past this fleeting moment. "Emma," he repeated, almost as if committing it to memory. For a moment, his gaze held hers, not with the air of someone accustomed to attention, but with quiet sincerity. "Thank you for bringing this out so quickly." The simplicity of his words left her momentarily speechless. She nodded, retreating a step as he reached for the fork and began to eat. But something in his demeanor kept drawing her attention. Barron opened the leather notebook again, his pen gliding across the pages with deliberate care. Emma couldn't help but wonder what he was writing, the notebook becoming a focal point of her curiosity. Outside, the SUV remained idle, as if guarding a secret. She stepped back behind the counter, her co-workers whispering behind her. Yet all Emma could focus on was the quiet mystery of this man, someone larger than life yet seated alone, scribbling away in a cafe as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As Barron delicately took a bite of the chocolate cake, Emma stole quick glances from behind the counter. He sat with an air of quiet purpose, his tall frame slightly hunched over the small table. The worn leather notebook remained open in front of him, his pen moving steadily across its pages. The cafe had regained some of its normal rhythm, but the occasional whisper still floated in the air. "Do you think he's writing something important?" one of the staff asked softly. Emma shook her head, pretending not to care, but her own curiosity burned brighter with each passing second. What could someone like him, a figure tied to wealth and power, be jotting down so intently in such an unassuming place? Suddenly, a small voice broke through the soft murmurs. "Mama, isn't that the tall boy from TV?" A boy no older than 6 tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing innocently in Barron's direction. Emma stiffened, as did the other staff. All eyes darted to Barron, who had clearly overheard. For a moment, everyone held their breath, fearing the moment might unravel into something chaotic. But Barron simply looked up, his expression calm. To everyone's surprise, he offered the boy a small, kind smile. With a gentle motion of his hand, he signaled for the child to keep it quiet. It wasn't a shushing gesture. It was something softer, more understanding, as though he appreciated the boy's innocence but valued his solitude. The child's face lit up, nodding eagerly, as though he'd just been entrusted with a great secret. His mother quickly ushered him back to their table, whispering apologies to no one in particular. Emma felt her heart tighten. That small gesture, it wasn't what she expected. It wasn't the reaction of someone who thought himself above the rest, but rather, someone who understood the weight of being noticed. Returning to his seat, Barron took another sip of his coffee, his focus shifting back to his notebook. But for Emma, that moment lingered. The kindness he'd shown wasn't for show. It wasn't rehearsed. It was real, raw, and entirely unexpected. As she watched him from afar, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than the world might ever see. Emma busied herself at the counter, but her eyes kept drifting toward the corner table where Barron sat. There was something oddly grounding about his presence, calm yet commanding, as though he carried the weight of 2 worlds effortlessly. His quiet demeanor and the mystery of that leather notebook tugged at her curiosity. Her coworkers had stopped whispering, and the cafe had slipped back into its usual rhythm. Yet, for Emma, the air felt heavier, like something was about to happen. She didn't know why she felt so drawn to him. Maybe it was the unguarded kindness he'd shown the little boy earlier, or perhaps the way he seemed lost in his thoughts, scribbling away. As she wiped down the counter for the 3rd time, Barron stood up, his towering frame making him impossible to ignore. He picked up his plate and cup and began walking toward the counter. Emma's heart thudded in her chest. Why would someone like him, someone so accustomed to being served, bring his dishes over? He set the plate and cup down gently and looked at her, his blue eyes soft but inquisitive. "Emma," he said, and hearing her name in his low, steady voice caught her off guard. "Yes," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you like working here?" The question was simple, but it carried a weight she hadn't expected. Emma blinked, momentarily stunned. No one had ever asked her that before, not with genuine interest. I suppose I do," she stammered. "It's not easy, but it pays the bills." Barron nodded, as if he understood more than he let on. "It must be hard, balancing everything." His words hit a nerve she didn't realize was exposed. The exhaustion of late nights, the worry of making ends meet, the guilt of not spending enough time with her son. It all rushed to the surface. She bit her lip, trying to keep her emotions in check. Before she could respond, Barron added, "You seem like someone who cares deeply. That's rare." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. For a moment, it felt like he wasn't just talking about her job, but something deeper. Emma nodded, unable to find the right words. And then, just like that, he smiled faintly and returned to his seat, leaving her standing there, caught between surprise and a strange sense of being seen. Emma stood frozen for a moment, her hands still resting on the counter where Barron had just stood. His simple question echoed in her mind. "Do you like working here?" His words, though soft, carried an understanding that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in a long time. As she turned back to the counter, her breath caught in her throat. It was as though the busy cafe, the clinking of cups, and the chatter of customers had all faded into the background, leaving just the weight of his quiet presence. Her fingers fumbled with the cloth she was holding, wiping down the same spot over and over, trying to steady herself. Why had he asked me that? She wondered. People like Barron Trump didn't often take an interest in the lives of servers. They were used to being admired, to receiving things without question, without a second thought. Yet here he was, looking at her with an unusual sincerity, as though her answer mattered. From the corner of her eye, she watched him again. He had returned to his table, but his focus seemed split between his notebook and the world around him. There was something deeply contemplative in the way he observed the cafe, as if he was constantly analyzing, trying to make sense of things that no one else could see. The other staff continued their usual routines, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something small yet significant had passed between them, an exchange that seemed to transcend the surface. Her mind replayed the conversation, and she couldn't help but wonder if he saw something in her, something others didn't. Did he sense the exhaustion behind her eyes, the unspoken weight she carried each day? As she approached his table once more to clear the plates, she found herself hesitating. She wasn't sure if she was ready to break the fragile quiet that had settled between them. But then, to her surprise, Barron looked up from his notebook and offered her a soft smile, a look that held no judgment, only a quiet understanding. "Emma," he said again, this time without the formality. "I hope you know your work doesn't go unnoticed." Her heart skipped a beat. His words were so simple, yet they struck deep. It was as if, for the first time in years, someone was acknowledging her efforts. Someone who didn't have to. She nodded, unable to speak, the weight of her emotions catching in her throat. Emma's heart raced as she stood there, still caught between Barron's kind words and the overwhelming emotions that his presence stirred. She had never expected a moment like this to unfold in her life, certainly not here, in the dimly lit cafe, amidst the hum of background noise and the steam rising from the espresso machine. For a brief moment, it felt like time itself had slowed, drawing her into the quiet world of Barron Trump, where understanding seemed to linger in every gesture. As she cleared the table, Emma found herself stealing glances at him again. The walls of her own thoughts began to crumble, walls she had spent years building up to protect herself from feeling too much. The weight of her struggles, the loneliness that crept in when she returned to her empty apartment after long shifts, the exhaustion that weighed down her every step, all of it bubbled to the surface. And there, in Barron's unspoken gaze, she felt a recognition that no one had ever offered her before. His sincerity, the way he had looked at her, not as a mere waitress but as someone worthy of respect, was a rare gift. But it wasn't just his words. It was the way he allowed her space to exist, to be more than the tired, overworked woman she often saw in the mirror. In his presence, Emma felt a strange sense of relief, as though, for a moment, the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders. She didn't know what it was about him. Was it the quiet strength that emanated from him, the fact that he seemed so attuned to the world around him, or perhaps something deeper that connected them both in a way she couldn't yet understand? Whatever it was, it made her feel like she wasn't alone. Barron's smile faded as he noticed the shift in Emma's expression. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said gently, his voice soft but steady. "It's just that people like you often go unnoticed, but not by me." The simple sincerity in his words tugged at Emma's heart. She blinked rapidly, willing the sting of tears away. She wasn't used to this kind of kindness, this raw, unfiltered recognition. It felt like a weight she hadn't realized she had been carrying was slowly being lifted. "I'm not used to being noticed like this," she whispered, her voice shaky, but her heart strangely open. Emma stood there, the weight of Barron's words lingering in the air between them. She had never realized how much she had craved acknowledgement, how deeply she had longed for someone to see her beyond the surface. The quiet strength in his gaze had cut through the layers she had built around herself, leaving her vulnerable, yet oddly comforted. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat refusing to dissolve. It's been hard, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't intended to say it out loud, but it spilled from her lips before she could stop it. The admission felt raw, like a hidden wound that had finally been exposed to the light. Barron's eyes softened, his expression becoming even more thoughtful. He didn't rush to fill the silence with empty words. Instead, he simply nodded, as if understanding everything she hadn't said. In that moment, Emma realized he wasn't just offering sympathy. He was offering something much deeper, an unspoken understanding. It was as if he had known what it was like to carry the weight of 1,000 silent burdens, to wear a mask of strength while the world around you demanded more than you could give. "You don't have to explain," he said, his voice low, reassuring. "I can see it in your eyes." His words weren't just comforting. They were freeing. For the first time in ages, Emma didn't feel like she had to hide her weariness, her doubts, or the doubts she had about herself. Barron wasn't judging her. He was simply there, offering the kind of unspoken support that most people didn't even know how to give. She shook her head slightly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I never thought someone like you would notice," she admitted, the honesty in her words feeling like a weight had been lifted. She hadn't expected him to look at her in this way, as if her struggles mattered to him. It was a strange sensation, one that made her feel both exposed and oddly safe at the same time. Barron's smile was soft but full of understanding. "I notice more than people think," he said. "Everyone has a story, Emma. It's just a matter of being willing to listen." Emma stood there, her heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. Barron's words hung in the air like a gentle embrace, wrapping around her fragile thoughts, calming them. "Everyone has a story," he had said, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Emma allowed herself to believe that her story mattered too. She looked down at the floor for a moment, gathering herself, unsure of how to respond. Her hands, which had been trembling ever since she spoke so openly, rested on the edge of the table, seeking some stability. She had always prided herself on keeping a wall between her heart and the world, but Barron had effortlessly chipped away at it with nothing but kindness and genuine curiosity. Her eyes lifted back to his, and she saw the same quiet understanding there, no judgment, no rush to move on. It was as if he had opened a door, offering her the chance to step into a place where she didn't have to pretend everything was fine. In a world that constantly told her to keep going, to stay strong, she found herself, for the first time, allowing the cracks to show. And Barron didn't look away. Emma inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself, and when she spoke, her voice felt almost foreign to her, like she was hearing it for the first time. "I've been so tired," she admitted, the words slipping out as if the weight of them had been carried for far too long. "Tired of pretending that everything's okay, that I'm okay, but I'm not. Not really." She winced, but when she looked at Barron, his steady gaze kept her grounded. He simply nodded, his expression calm and patient, as though he had been expecting her to say this all along. His eyes softened with a gentle, reassuring sincerity, and Emma felt her defenses crumble a little more. "You don't have to be okay all the time," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay to not be okay." For the first time, Emma allowed herself to let the tears fall, not in sorrow, but in relief. She hadn't realized how much she had needed to hear those words until they left his lips. There was no rush to push her emotions aside, no judgment, only a quiet moment of recognition, a moment where she could just be. The tears that had threatened to spill now quietly traced down Emma's cheeks, each drop a silent confession, a release she hadn't allowed herself in years. She hadn't expected this moment, didn't even know she needed it, but here she was, standing before Barron, with all her walls crumbled and exposed, and somehow, in the vulnerability she felt, there was peace. Barron didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence was like a steady anchor in the storm of her emotions. There was a calm in his stillness, a kind of silent strength that invited Emma to simply be. She had expected awkwardness, perhaps even judgment, but there was none of that. There was only this, a shared understanding, one that she couldn't explain but deeply felt. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, half laughing at herself for being so emotional in front of a stranger. But Barron wasn't just any stranger. He had reached a place in her heart that few had ever gotten to, and now, with the weight of her own feelings pressing down on her, she didn't want to pull away. She didn't want to hide anymore. "You don't have to apologize for being human," Barron said quietly, his voice soothing and unhurried. There was no rush in his tone, no discomfort with the rawness of the moment. It was like he understood the chaos in her heart, the exhaustion, the constant battle between wanting to break free and needing to hold it all together. Emma nodded, her throat tight as she tried to compose herself. But there was no need to pretend in this space, not anymore. She could feel Barron's understanding enveloping her, lifting some of the weight she had carried alone for so long. "I guess I just forgot what it felt like to be seen," she whispered, almost embarrassed by the truth. "To feel like someone actually sees me, not just the waitress, not just the job." Barron's smile was warm, comforting, and it seemed to reach right into Emma's soul. He didn't offer advice, didn't tell her to snap out of it. He just gave her the space to breathe. "You matter, Emma," he said softly, his words cutting through the noise in her mind, "in ways you don't even realize." In that moment, everything that had felt so heavy in her life, her doubts, her struggles, her loneliness, suddenly didn't seem so unbearable. For the first time, she could breathe without feeling like the air was too thick, too heavy to inhale. The silence that followed Barron's words hung in the air like a delicate thread, unspoken yet tangible, weaving an invisible bond between Emma and him. She had thought, at first, that no one could ever understand the depths of what she had carried for so long. But now, standing here in this moment, she realized how wrong she had been. Barron's quiet presence was more than enough. He didn't try to fix her, didn't try to offer solutions to problems that couldn't be solved in an instant. He simply allowed her to be. And in that, Emma found something unexpected: comfort. Not pity, not sympathy, just a shared understanding that words couldn't fully express. As Emma stood there, her heart still racing from the emotional release, she felt something stir within her. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and she could finally see herself clearly. She had always been so focused on keeping up the appearance of strength, of being the person everyone needed her to be, that she had lost touch with the simple truth. She was allowed to be vulnerable. She was allowed to need help. She was allowed to break down, to cry, to feel. "I never expected to feel this way," Emma murmured, her voice softer now, the weight of her emotions still raw but no longer suffocating. "I've spent so much of my life pretending to be okay. But I don't have to anymore, do I?" Barron didn't answer right away, as if he were letting the words sink in. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, grounded. "No, you don't have to be okay all the time. And you shouldn't feel like you have to." The honesty in his words settled over Emma like a blanket, warm and comforting. She looked up at him, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. For the first time, it felt genuine. She didn't feel like she had to put on a mask. With Barron, she could be herself, flawed, tired, human. And he would still see her, not for her role, but for who she truly was. In that shared silence, an unspoken bond formed. One that didn't need words, didn't need explanation. It was simply there, a quiet connection between two people who had found understanding in each other's presence.